All right, only two more modules to go. This is module 5, change management. So, because of module 4 having the larger project and assignment work to do, I want to make sure that modules 5 and 6 don't have as much work, just so we can focus on getting that project done as the team. So this is pretty much just going through PowerPoints. I'll give you a couple of other examples of cost control log and stuff, ways you manage change and some of the documentation that I've used in the past to help manage all these changes in the work, cost, the schedule, all that stuff. There's no assignment for this one. There is a discussion post that are based on, combining the ideas of changes, change conditions, and time, how they all relate to each other, how they relate to the legal aspects of construction and the contracts. And then obviously you have a quiz too. So it's just the discussion post and the quiz for this one. I hope you put a lot of thought into the discussion post because of anything that you do in construction as a manager, you are going to be dealing with changes and being well organized, being thoughtful ahead of time, trying to get out in front of changes, get out in front of issues ahead of time is a big deal. That's where, tying in the scopes and everything you've learned so far, understanding your risk involved in making decisions, because the changes will happen. They'll happen fast. Sometimes they are big changes. Sometimes they are small, but they are constant. So managing them is the biggest challenge and one of the most time-consuming tasks you'll be dealing with as a project manager or superintendent, because now you are affecting the quality of work, you're affecting the time, you're affecting the cost of the project, and you want to make sure that everything's very clear. So getting ahead of that in the bidding process, the scope writing process, the post-bid meeting process, awarding subcontractors and making sure that they are aware of how we're going to be managing and handling changes are good practices. This PowerPoint is talking about changes and change conditions. I'll just walk you through a couple of the main things. It is important to understand that changes and change conditions are two different legal things. So one of them is constituted by for two things: errors and omissions in the document. Usually it's found by subcontractors, or they are sought by the owner or the architect or AE. Sometimes even the contractor might decide they'd like to make a change and recommend some things. So instead of rewriting contracts, what we do is we amend them in the form of change orders. There's other documents too. There are specific clauses within your documents in your contracts. I'll let you go through a lot of these things, but I do want to talk about what a bulletin and PR is, because if the owner, actually I should walk through this entire process right here. So the contract change process for errors and omissions, usually this is discovered in the field. Then a subcontractor would issue an RFI. So that's one document, request for information, if you haven't heard of it. Subcontractor issues that RFI requesting additional information on whatever the issue is. That goes to the contractor, who then reviews it and submits the RFI to the architect, who reviews it with the owner. They discuss it. If they believe that that change is valid, they will issue maybe a new drawing, maybe new some sort of information that helps get pricing on that item, and then we go from there. Then we have to submit pricing back through the subcontractor, through the contractor, to the architect and engineer to review with the owner. If they agree to it, they might issue a change order. If they don't agree to it, they might issue what's called a CCD, or a contract change, or a construction change directive, or some other form of documentation, which is again very important to understand that in the pre-construction phases, how are we managing this with the architect and engineer? What processes do we have in place? We're all very aware of the documents being used, because as you'll see throughout this PowerPoint here, that there's a lot of different types of documents and they have specific purposes, and some of them are used incorrectly nowadays. So you have to know what you are liable for, because if you use some of these documents incorrectly and you have, it comes down to your responsibility. You might not know that you just signed the wrong document and you've agreed to basically no cost changes or something along those lines. So this process is pretty cumbersome. Normally what we end up doing actually in the field is, if there's an issue, we call the architect, we discuss it, we decide that there's probably a change. Let's track it on T&M, time and material tickets, and we'll go from there. We follow up then with the RFI, emails, whatever that process might be, to then eventually issue the change order with the actual contractual cost to change. Normally, those kind of issues do not have any kind of schedule impact. The other way that we would have changes on a project are from owner or AE initiating them. The big thing to understand here is if they initiate a change, what they would do is issue what's called a bulletin or a PR. They are the same thing depending on where you are within the country. So a PR is an AIA term and document. So what this means, though, is if you haven't done this process, the architect would then issue a bulletin that has, say, 5 items on it that they would like pricing on, that if they accept them, they will provide a change order for us to actually do the work. Right? So each of those 5 items has a pricing line. Each of your subcontractors will be issued this document through the contractor. They will have to then price those out in a certain time frame. Usually it's like a 2-week time frame. Contractor will have to take all those, tabulate them, put them on one, final bulletin cost document, and then issue that back to the architect. They will then review and see if they do want to pick any or all of those items, and then issue a change order for whatever ones they want. Generally, if they're going to be issuing them, shouldn't say most, but a lot of the time they're going to do an all or nothing. But sometimes they will just select maybe 4 of the 5 items. In theory, then, they should be reissuing a new set of documents that only include those 4 new items. The problem I've run into many times is architects might not, and they expect us as the contractor then to say, you have to tell your subs not to do these things on those 5 pages on the plans, which is not an easy thing to do. Because you're going to have a breakdown in communication somewhere within your subcontractors to try to figure that out. So the reason why I bring this up and why I care so much about this one is because bulletins are for pricing purposes only. They are not a directive to perform work. They are not supposed to be a catch-all. They are not supposed to include items that have already been changed and or the work has been completed and or the work has been paid for through other change orders, and they're not supposed to be long and extensive. Now, I've had projects where we've gone through bulletins that have 150 to 250 line items on them. When you start doing things like that, subcontractors get really frustrated, which I totally agree with, because now you're basically repricing entire projects while we're trying to build the current project. I've also seen it happen where architects decide they want to make sure that whatever RFIs to date, they're not going to issue documents for the RFI responses or for change orders. They're going to wait and catch them all into a bulletin and issue them. The problem you run into there is, again, an example I have is we had about 50 or so RFIs that were responded to on a project, 40 of which, roughly, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but 40 of which had been already written into change orders for the subcontractors, approved, obviously, and then the work had been completed. But now they're included again on a bulletin. So now it gets confusing to say, do we reprice this? Is this a new thing? What are we doing? Those are then in combination with new items that have not been included yet on a project, or bigger items that were coming from alternates that we already knew about. So then they try to do that as a catch-all just so you can issue one giant set of documents instead of doing multiple small iterations of document updates. I have a major problem with that because managing that is extremely complicated and cumbersome. Subcontractors get confused. They start building the wrong things because they're not sure which drawings we're working from anymore because that's not clear. So make sure that, again, pre-construction is extremely important for these kind of things. You do not want to be liable because of a catch-all type bulletin scenario where subs are now building things from old plans that are no longer approved or building things on new plans that have not been approved yet. So make sure you understand the ramifications of how bulletins and PRs should be utilized, and you use those red flags for if that's not how they're being used. Again, things to talk about with the architect and design team in pre-construction to clarify this process. Can't emphasize that one enough. If we're going the right process, the only time you should be actually performing that work is when a CCD or a CO is issued, right, and written to the contractor. Let's see. Moving through here. Right, a CCD I mentioned just briefly, construction change directive. So this is a weird one. A lot of people think that a CCD is a very unfair type clause because it sounds like the architect and engineer and owners don't agree to the price, but they're going to make you do the work anyway. In reality, what it means is they've agreed to the fact that there is a change in their documents. And if I get a CCD issued to me as the contractor, that means that I can now go perform the work without really that much risk on my shoulders. Normally, the process would be, we get a lot of changes that come up randomly, right? So a lot of times a owner might say, how much is that going to cost? You say it's $5,000. They don't believe it's going to cost $5,000, but they want the work to be done. They know it's going to be small enough that they can handle that within their bonding limits or whatever that might be. So they just issue us a CCD and we can get going. And that allows the subcontractors then say we'll track it on time and material, we'll deduct whatever else, what other work was originally planned for that space out. And ultimately what you're getting is the right price most likely for that work being done. So I'm a big fan of it. It's a little bit more paperwork, but it's a lot cleaner paperwork. So to me, it saves everyone a lot of time and money. Talked about addendas before, but changes in the bid are your addendas. There's also post-bid addendas to deal with. The other thing to mention too, and why I link time into changes, is because we often only think of cost or materials when it comes to changes. We don't often think of time, but it's really important to understand that time is a huge factor. If the owner is going to issue me a change order for $50,000 I did not originally have on my project, that means I now have $50,000 more worth of time to deal with as well, right? So maybe half of that is the material cost and the other half is time, right? I have to find that labor. We have to make sure that we have subcontractors available to do that. That is time added to a project that we have to be very cognizant of. Whether it actually extends my project or not is to be discussed through good scheduling practices, but that is important to note. Other documents and change processes. An ASI is Architect's Supplemental Information. This is technically not a change document, but I include it in change documents so you know what they are. It is only supposed to be used for additional information, things that you already know about. We just maybe are missing a color, missing a motor requirement, missing some sort of voltage requirement, like those kind of things that just get left out of the specs by accident, and we need to have clarification and documenting that this is the right product with this requirement. It is not a change document, but what I've seen a lot of times happen is, and it's a no cost item document. That means that we cannot price an ASI. So the information we're getting here is just for our purposes only, just so we know exactly what we're doing. But why I add this into a change document is because I've seen it many times where architects will issue an ASI instead of a PR or bulletin, or instead of a change directive or anything like that, with a lot of information on things that we do not have in the plans. Do not let anybody do this to you because you have to understand what that means. If you agree to that and it's all written that, yep, we're good to go, that means you cannot get the money for that change, whatever that is. You're agreeing to the fact that there's a zero cost change. I've only seen that happen a few times where we have architects I really did not have a good trust factor with, and most, I will say, do not do anything like that. But I have seen it. Don't want you to get caught with those issues. Field order and change order are just small things that are, no cost, no time impact. Something like, it's oftentimes a wash. Maybe there's, the example I use all the time is like if you're doing some in-wall like utility stuff, maybe my electrician needs to put an outlet somewhere, but there's something blocking his path, or a plumber needs to put something there that's blocking their path. Normally we just say, hey, is it okay if we move that thing like a foot or to the next cavity or whatever that might be in the wall, and say, yep, no problem at all. Right? It's kind of a no cost item, no time change item. We just normally follow up with a phone call, maybe something in writing, right, with just clarification purposes to make sure everyone understands, and for sure an as-built. Cardinal change is getting into a lot more stuff. Like this is where we're getting out of the general scope of work. I've only had to deal with this one time. We did not actually get a cardinal change for it, but it was just not worth our time to keep fighting it. We ended up doing the work anyways, but this is like adding entire different aspects of projects, big changes, big costs. The difference between changes then and change conditions, and why it's so important, is because change conditions are generally based on, they're discovered by errors and omissions only, but it's really just based on it's differing from what things are your different site conditions. So you have unforeseen conditions, and that's where we have a change condition issue. Normally, and again, you have to look at your contract and make sure you work this out in pre-construction, but normally what you're dealing with is your changes should not come out of contingency dollars. Your change conditions oftentimes come out of contingency dollars. Um, right? So we have something, maybe it's in the plans and specs that are indicated, like if it's a new build, it's normally going to be something with site or subsurface conditions. If it's renovation, we don't have additional things because it's a lot more reasonable to understand that when we start tearing down walls, we're going to find a whole bunch of stuff we did not know were in there, right? So these are things that are like really of no fault of anybody's. Errors and omissions in plans, that is a fault. So we, as the contractor, shouldn't have to take money out of our contingency dollars to pay for those if we're CM at risk. So that's kind of a big deal to understand the difference between the two because of how money gets spent. Now, I will tell you, as a CM at risk, I have more often than not covered changes that were directed by the owner or errors and omissions from the architect and the plans and specs out of contingency. Reason being, it was more of a trust factor with who the owner and architects are, and also understanding that the owner has bonding limits. So say, for instance, a $20 million project. They've been approved for the X amount of dollars for that 20 million bucks, including the contingency dollars. What they would rather do from an owner side point is utilize the money that they've already had approved that they can spend down all of it, which makes sense to them, instead of going for change orders and having to increase their limits. So what I would do in those situations is say, yep, that's fine. As long as we felt okay with where contingency was at the moment, we'd say it's fine, but, and in writing, state that if we exceed our contingency, we are owed up to X amount of dollars because of this change, should not be coming out of contingency, something along those lines. That way, the architect and owner have the ability to utilize that contingency fund that's already set up for it. But then at the same time, I'm protected as the contractor to say, yes, I know you want to spend down your money, and that's fine. We have it all available, and we don't have to go through the whole change order process. That's okay. But I'm not going to be held liable if I run into something during this renovation that we were not expecting, and I have to now pay for it out of that. Or if I have scope gaps or something like that where I now have to pay for it out of my contingency. So there are ways you can still skirt the system, make sure that works, right? Again, change conditions are important just to understand how, your pre-bid site inspections, site investigations, understanding what kind of risk you might have in play with all those kind of things. But let's see, I think there's a lot of different things you can go through. Understanding how contingency and allowances work, because how the money gets spent is really important. And then this last one is just important terms and acronyms. Let's see, when it comes to matters of time, there's a lot in here too, and I'll let you go through this as well. But I did want to emphasize the fact that you have to understand what your time provisions are, right? So you have a lot of things, both administratively and in the field, that you have to understand what my contractor is requiring, right? Are we talking like calendar days, fixed date of completion, working day schedules? Are there specific days we can't be working, specific hours, all that kind of stuff? How does that affect my schedule? LDs, the infamous curse word, right? Liquidated damages. What am I at risk for? And if you have LDs, you better be very cognizant of how changes impact your schedule and how you should try to remove that liability from you, right? So if it's a change condition, that's one thing. But if it's a change, those LDs you should not be held accountable for LDs on a certain date if my schedule gets pushed out because of changes. So understanding different influences on time, right? So things like, what time of the year are we working? Where is my geographic location? What type of complexity am I dealing with in this project? Is this occupied building? Is this new build, right? Is that renovation? Is it occupied or non-occupied? Do we have to do phases? Are those phases in the permitting process, like legal permit phases, or are we doing like our own individual phasing? Why are we doing those, right? Different influences based on administrative things like submittals and RFIs and bulletins, right? All those things influence our schedule. All those schedule influences influence our costs. All those things influence our quality at the end of the day. So it's understanding how to manage those and be very cognizant of the fact that each of these items are complicated. Um, you can go through float a little bit, and the other big F word that I like to make sure everyone knows very well is this word called fragment. And a fragment is basically a new activity in your schedule. What constitute those fragments? It's changes, right? So different things that come up. In a PR or bulletin comes up that influences our time, I better have a fragment in my schedule that I now relink the sequence of logic within that schedule, so that if that fragment takes too long for us to resolve, it's going to start impacting our overall schedule, right? So if I put a bulletin in there and it's taking way too long for us to review, get priced, all that kind of stuff, get approved, well, that's going to impact everything beyond that, because how am I supposed to keep going with the work in some of these locations if we don't know what we're doing? So those are big things to include and make sure that the architect and owner are very well aware ahead of time that that's how we're going to be managing our scheduling processes and our changes. Understanding overtime is a big deal. When do we use it? Why do we use it? How do we use it? Right? Who's responsible to pay for all that kind of stuff? Different circumstances call for different things. So understanding your contract clauses for how overtime can be used. And beyond that, understanding with your project team, your architects and owners, how we're going to use overtime. I've had projects where they cut out 6 months of the design schedule and then cut out 6 months of a construction schedule and expect us to finish on time. Well, I'm going to be using overtime, but we can't just waste our overtime. We got to be very, very thoughtful and specialized with where and how we're going to be using it and who's paying for it and out of what pot of money. So those are the big things to indicate there. I know I'm kind of running long again on this, but I'm very passionate about changes. They're very complicated. Again, I included a cost control log because every time I had anything that would potentially be a change, whether it's time, cost, whatever that is, I'd put it on a change on the CCL, and that's how we'd track it across. So feel free to use those. Those are just supplemental information for you guys to deal with. This change management one's supplemental as well for you to deal with. Like I said before, you just have your discussion post and your changes and time quiz, and that is it for Module 5. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in Module 6.